Hello, my name's Katie and I'm one of the OTs here at LifeTech. In this webcast, I wanted to take you through some of the initial considerations for kitchen design, which you might consider when building or renovating. The concepts that I'll discuss today are relevant for anyone who might be designing a kitchen, be it a young couple renovating their first home, a family updating their kitchen to enable wheelchair access, or an aging user who wants to update their kitchen to create something more functional and easy to use. Some of the reasons that an OT may need to think about kitchen design principles are for the following. To discuss future-proofing and accessibility with our clients. People are wanting to stay at home for as long as possible for obvious reasons, and we are seeing more requests in the area of home modification and design from both people who are aging and those with differing levels of ability. Kitchens are also a really important part of the family home. They are often the social hub or gathering point of the home. Therefore, it is imperative that they can be accessed by all. It is also imperative that a person be able to complete some basic meal prep to promote a higher level of independence by reducing their reliance on other family members or carers. Before we even commence planning for a kitchen, there are some things that you need to consider. The questions to ask are, who is using the kitchen and what tasks do they want to be able to do? Look at the layout. What's existing? Could it be improved upon? Does it even need modifying? Could it just be rearranging? If it does, how much modification is required? In some cases, we might even look at removing a wall, as that could really change everything within a kitchen. What are some of the minimum requirements or components required? Does it need a wheelchair accessible work surface? Is a side opening wall mounted oven a minimum requirement for the family? We also need to look at the access, and that could be the client's access to cupboards, to benches, to sinks, and also looking at what the strengths are of the kitchen already and if there are any barriers that we need to try to address. First things first, we need to consider the person who will be using the kitchen. Anthropometrics are the measurement of the size and proportions of the human body. We use these measurements to determine setup, positioning and layout. In a kitchen, measurements of the user are essential to ensure that the kitchen is functional and that everything works. For example, we would take the measurement of a person's maximum forward reach to determine the width of the bench. We would also take the measurement from the floor to the person's bent elbow to determine a suitable bench height. Some of the measurements you can also see on the slide. These are important things to consider regardless of whether the person is able-bodied or if they do have a disability. The next step is to consider those things that might affect a person's function and access in the kitchen. Most commonly, it is physical factors that we both see and consider that affect a person's ability to use the kitchen, like physical factors such as arthritis, people who might use a wheelchair, frail age, a bad back, and so on. But it's also important not to forget other factors that can also affect function, such as sensory loss perhaps, maybe a loss of vision, hearing impairment, or a cognitive impairment, which might lead to reduced awareness of safety, confusion in the kitchen, which might in turn lead to frustration and danger. Some of the things that we need to consider for people with physical limitations might be some of the following. How will the person move in the kitchen? How much space do they need to move? What do they need to be able to reach? Does the kitchen layout need to change based on these physical limitations? What alternative features are available to reduce dead space and make the kitchen as accessible as possible? And is the person's safety compromised in any way as a result of their physical limitations? Earlier we talked about anthropometric measurements of people and how important these are. For people using mobility aids, we also need to factor in the size of their equipment. By adding in a piece of equipment, we need to consider how circulation space and movement through the kitchen is affected. An example of this might be that a person might use a walker but fatigues when completing tasks in the kitchen. So as well as having a walker, they might also have a perch stool that they need to contend with. As a result, we might need to think about reducing the number of cupboards and increasing the total circulation space. The reach range for a person with a mobility aid might be shorter as well, so we might need to consider shortening the width of countertops or consider including clear access underneath the counter to allow a person to get closer. Some of the other measurements that you might consider taking can also be seen on the slide. For people with sensory loss, there are questions that we need to ask. We need to know what type of sensory impairment the person has and what the extent of their sensory loss is. We need to know how the person is currently compensating for their sensory loss in the kitchen. Maybe they've developed their own adaptations for working in the kitchen and completing the required tasks. Is the person's safety compromised in the kitchen as well as a result of their sensory loss? It's also important to know that there are a range of assistive technology options available to assist in the kitchen, be it a liquid level sensor to note when a cup is filling up, or textured paint on an oven dial so the user can feel where they need to turn the knob to. You might also consider some safety items such as gas cut-off switches, smoke detectors or flood detectors as well. Contrast is really important for some people with vision impairments, and it is something you might incorporate into your design. For example, you might have the cupboards one colour but have the bench top another so that the person can easily differentiate between the two. For people with a cognitive impairment, we need to think a little bit differently. We need to know what type of cognitive impairment the person has, be it memory loss or be it a reduced awareness of their safety. We also need to know what their limitations are in regards to their impairment. This may also change some of the features that we have in a kitchen. For example, we might look at including see-through doors in the kitchen cabinetry so that the person can see exactly what's inside the door. We might also have to look at lockable cabinetry so that things that could put the person to harm are out of harm's way. You might consider installing an induction cooktop, which means that as soon as the pot is removed from the stove goes cold. In this case, we might again consider those gas cut-off switches or talking smoke detectors. These are really cool in that you can record in instructions for the person to follow in the case of an emergency. Another thing that we see sometimes in kitchens are prompt or cue cards to help a person get through and complete the important tasks, or they might be used to define locations. So you might have a sign on the cabinet that says plates or cups or whatever it is the person needs to find quite frequently. Now we'll take some time to talk about some of the considerations for kitchen layout. We can see that as time has progressed, the styling and layout of kitchens has changed quite a bit, but the main purpose and requirements have stayed the same. When we look at these two pictures, we can see the same things: a cooking space, which may include a stove top or an oven, a food storage space, so your fridge or your pantry, a food preparation space, and then finally a washing up area. The biggest difference between these two kitchens is the space, and as such, we need to consider how to make the most of this. There was a wonderful book available for a while called Welcome: Design Ideas for Accessible Housing. It covered accessible design principles, but unfortunately the book is no longer available. We are lucky enough to have a copy here at LifeTech, which runs over some of the key components of a good kitchen. It suggests that a kitchen should have adequate space for moving around, work surfaces at an appropriate height, access to car and waste disposal areas to enable easy transport of groceries and rubbish, access to the meals or dining area where the food will be consumed, adequate and appropriate storage, suitable lighting, convenient fittings, handles and controls, and ideally it will also include a window to maximise natural light and promote social interaction between the cooking and main dining area. One of the first things that is considered when building or redesigning a kitchen is the layout and placement of those things that we use regularly. A work triangle specifically relates to the travelled distance between the three most commonly used items: the fridge, the stove, and the sink. The concept behind this was that the closer these items were together, the more efficient the kitchen space would be. It was developed in the 1940s, when in most cases the kitchen was the domain of the woman of the house, who was in charge of the cooking, and there was rarely anybody else in the space. As 70 years has passed since the initial development of the work triangle principle, homes have become larger, as have families. We have more appliances than just the standard fridge and cooktop, and the kitchen has also become an integral part of the family home, with everyone getting involved in the space. With more people in the kitchen, it is obvious that it can get crowded, so there's been consideration of the idea of work zones as opposed to triangles to increase the efficiency in the kitchen. House is a great website with some great ideas in terms of design principles for kitchens. When they talk about work zones, they suggest considering the following: group appliances and fixtures close according to use. So you might think of putting the sink and the dishwasher together with a bin close by to streamline cleaning up. Store what you need where you need it most. For example, you might have a designated prep space for making bread, where you store everything that you need directly underneath. You might also think about keeping your oil right next to the stovetop, where you use it the most. Consider providing landings next to the major appliances, such as your stove, your oven, your fridge or your microwave. This just reduces your need to have to carry stuff across the kitchen. You might even consider creating a kids zone. For a lot of families now, they might have the kids completing their homework while they're cooking dinner. You might even consider having a zone for guests if you have a really large open plan kitchen, so that you can be really engaged in the conversations that are happening, regardless of whether you're cooking or not. You might also look at widening the aisles of the kitchen if you've got bench tops that maybe run across two walls. The livable housing guidelines suggest that you have a minimum of 1200 mils between benches, so 1.2 metres. If you're using a wheelchair, you might consider the minimum distance as 1.5 metres, just so you've got enough space to turn the chair around. I mentioned the livable housing guidelines, and this is a document that has been created to outline some of the requirements for home design to ensure accessibility for everybody, be it an able-bodied person or a wheelchair user. You can find a copy of the livable housing guidelines at the link on your slide, or just put livable housing guidelines into Google. Another aspect of kitchen design to consider is the layout of the kitchen cabinetry and associated storage. When you think about storage, you want to place the most frequently used items in that middle band shown on the diagram. So that's generally the space between the person's shoulders and their hips. You want to put those seldomly used heavy items on the lower band, and maybe some of your lighter items that aren't used quite as often in those higher levels. One thing you can also see in this diagram is that there are areas that will be difficult to reach for a number of reasons. It's important to note that there are a range of assistive technology options available and layout designs that can make a kitchen more easily accessible. We will be releasing a second webcast going through a few of these items in the near future, so keep an eye out on the website for when that release will happen. When it comes to kitchen design and layout, things have changed a lot as time has passed. This is leading to designers and innovators coming up with new ideas to create efficiency without impacting on the style. One of many suppliers who is passionate about finding ways to create practical solutions is Blom, who's a supplier of kitchen componentry. They discuss the kitchen as a dynamic space, and every kitchen needs to consider the three essential features. So this is workflow, space, and motion. Workflow consists of an orchestrated and repeatable pattern of activity. In this instance, maximising workflow comes by minimising other factors such as movement, so reducing the need to walk, to bend, to stretch, to kneel, to get to all of those things that you need. It really relates and makes you think about having what you need to have right where you need it, when you need it. Blom also talks about the concept of work zones. So their thinking follows the idea that workflow patterns are fairly close to always being the same and regularly repeated. So if items that are used together are zoned together, it reduces the overall time, effort and movement required around the kitchen. They've broken the kitchen into 5 zones and developed layouts that they believe maximise workflow, including having storage for consumables, so where your fridge is, storage for non-consumables, such as your pantry, having a cooking space, a cleaning space, and a food preparation space. When looking at storage space, we need to consider the following. What height of a space do we have? What's the width? And what's the depth? User requirements will also impact on the amount and location of storage space required or requested. This might include or be impacted by the size of the household, the lifestyle of the users, the family's cooking and shopping habits, and the abilities of the user, so be it any physical limitations or sensory limitations that the person might have. So now we've covered the theory, and I'm sure you really want to know about the application of some of these principles. In our next webinar, we will discuss some of the products and accessories that you might consider when next renovating your kitchen. If you do have any other questions though in the meantime, please feel free to contact LifeTech. You can call us on 1300 885 886, or you can visit our display centres in Brisbane or Townsville. Until next time, take care and enjoy thinking about some of these wonderful kitchen design ideas.